Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the July 12th, 2012 meeting of the Implementation Committee of the State Allocation Board. I'm Bill Savage. I'm the Assistant Executive Officer for the State Allocation Board, and happy to be here today. Why don't we go around the room and start with Ms. Constancio, and she can introduce herself and let us know who she represents.
Lisa Constancio for the Department of Education, representing Fred Yeager today.
Lee Coop with CASBO.
Paul Hansen, representing the county schools.
Eric Bakke, representing Los Angeles Unified.
Brian LaPrasse from OPSC.
Dennis Dunstan, representing the Council of Educational Facility Planners.
Mary Morris from the American Institute of Architects.
Richard Conrad, representing the Department of General Services / the Division of the State Architect.
And OPSC will have Michael Watanabe come up for another one of the items, and I see another of our members coming in right now, so we'll ask Jeremy to introduce himself.
Jeremy Smith with the State Building Trades.
That's fine. We're just getting going. Welcome. So be sure to use your mics, everyone, and if there's any comments, use the mics at the tables from the audience. We are webcasting the proceedings, and the meeting we will end our meeting by 1:30 today, and potentially could be done earlier than that, but that's our end point at this time. And I want to make sure. Actually, let me turn it over to who wants to talk about going green. Brian.
Brian O'Dell, Office of Public School Construction. Consistent with the Going Green efforts with the State Allocation Board, where we're printing less paper, we're moving more into the electronic digital age. So one of the things that we're looking at is ways to reduce the number of copies that we print for the Implementation Committee package. And just this morning, two of the members said, "Oh, I don't need a copy because I already have one." So what we would like is for the members to tell us, do they still want a hard copy? Obviously, it would be different if we had a revision and had to post something the morning of. But if it goes out, you know, a few days earlier, is it still necessary to print? Everyone's fine?
I prefer electronic copy, right?
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
You're not going to mention the member that you turned his thing today because you want to electronic copy?
One of them, I believe, was the member representing the Division of State Architect. Yes, that was one of them. We'll also continue to have hard copies for the audience. We'll print a dozen or so, print more or less as needed. So the idea is that if people are already printing them, let's not duplicate our efforts. We come back, put a big stack of in the recycle bin every month. So let us know if you still want a hard copy. If not, we'll just assume that everyone doesn't. Thank you.
But I think it is important to know, and the chair of the allocation board wanted us to make sure, and he referenced it at our last meeting, that even though we are going green, we will be providing printed copies for the public at both all of our public meetings, Implementation Committee, State Allocation Board meeting, et cetera. So we don't want to make sure, we're not expecting every member of the public to walk in with an iPad or a laptop ready to go. So anyway. Thank you, Brian. Is there any public comment for items that are not on the agenda? Okay, hearing none. Can we talk about our schedule of meetings? We set up this meeting on a Thursday, partly because there was some unclarity regarding how the furloughs for state workers were going to be implemented, whether they would essentially be set on one day or another. And right now, my understanding is that the furloughs are a floating day, and so there's not necessarily a need for us to take the meeting off of a Friday. And so my understanding is that OPSC staff prefers Fridays, and I'd like to get the sense of the committee if that's okay if we go back to Fridays.
Friday.
Okay, a great way to end the week is what you're telling me, right? Okay, so we'll assume that our next meeting will be on Friday, August. Somebody have it? What's that?
August 10th.
August 10th. Excellent. And I do want to take a second. We have two items on the agenda today. And we also have a potential referral if anyone was there for the last State Allocation Board meeting. You'll recall that the chair referred an issue to us related to statute of limitations. That's being developed by OPSC and may eventually come to the implementation committee, but it's also may change. It's not clear what the direction is yet, but that was referenced by our chair, Mr. Reyes, at the last allocation board meeting. So, that said, let's start with our first item, and I'm going to turn it over to Valerie and Brian to talk about K-8's hybrid MEFs.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Valerie Castro with the Office of Public School Construction. The purpose of this item is to continue the discussion we began last month regarding use of grants requests to fund construction of multipurpose room gymnasium hybrids, and identify how we can define the space for purposes of verifying state grants and processing them. The school facility program regulations permit districts to request a use of grants to build so-called minimum essential facilities such as MPRs and gymnasiums, but they do not address hybrids of different MEFs that are located within the same structure. Before we get into the discussion, I'd like to clarify that when we discuss MEFs, we're only talking about determining the state contribution for these facilities, not establishing size requirements. Districts have the option of building larger facilities using other fund sources. The reason for the limitation on state funding for these facilities is based on the use of grants request. Typically, new construction pupil grants are used to construct new classrooms to relieve overcrowding and house projected new students. When a district requests a use of grants for an MEF, those grants are no longer available to build classrooms. Therefore, the SFP regulations cap the number of pupil grants that can be used. As discussed at the June meeting, this item stems from a recent school district appeal to expand an existing multipurpose room to include a full gymnasium functionality under the use of grants option. The OPSC determined that the expansion of the existing multipurpose room was not permissible under current regulations, but the district could build a separate gymnasium at the school site. The district appealed the OPSC's finding to the State Allocation Board, which funded the expansion area as if it were a separate gymnasium. The board also directed the OPSC staff to revise the SFP regulations to address hybrid projects such as the one in the recent appeal. Elementary schools would not be eligible for an MPR gym hybrid because they're not eligible for a gymnasium under the use of grants option. However, MPR gym hybrids could potentially be requested at middle schools, high schools, or schools that combine grade levels such as K-8 school sites. In an MPR gymnasium hybrid, much of the space would be open and common, making it impossible to identify what portion of the space is gymnasium and what portion is MPR. We don't believe there would be other hybrid scenarios that pose this particular problem in distinguishing the type of space. For example, a library administration building at an alternative education site would have clearly defined spaces. However, if the committee is aware of other hybrid combinations that would have a common space, then these need to be identified. We've listed this and some other considerations on page 4 of your meeting packets.
And are you finished with your presentation? Okay. Any comments or discussion? Lisa?
Just a real general comment, and I brought this up to staff. Valerie, you mentioned that in her introduction she talked about how each of these should be identified. And I guess from the department's perspective, I think we should leave it a little more open, and instead of really trying to hone in on hybrid, multipurpose / gymnasium or whatever those may be, we'd be more comfortable if it just said hybrid, especially if you're going to go through the process of changing regulations right now and restricting ourselves to one type of facility. I know that this is within the restraints of the use of grants, so I understand that we're defined in that box, so I understand that, but I just think it would probably be more helpful to leave it a little more open since we really don't know what those type of hybrid facilities may be. So that's just a general comment. I've mentioned this to staff already, but from the department's perspective, we just wanted it a little more open.
So is there a summary of the items that are considered buildable under use of grants? Isn't that in the item on the chart in the back? Or
Actually, it's in the regulations on page 4. If you look at letter A, starting on the third line, it lists the types of facilities that can be constructed: a multi-purpose gymnasium and/or library, or for an alternative education school to construct a multi-purpose gymnasium, library, counseling offices, and/or conference rooms.
it's attachment A.
Yeah, if you look at page 7, actually, you can see the chart that we use.
So I have a question. So Lisa, you were talking about some other options. It sounds like if you look at the regulation under the item A on attachment A, that the alternative education school has greater options in terms of counseling offices, conference rooms, that kind of thing, than just a regular school. Am I reading that right? Okay. But you're saying, nonetheless, if we're going to do a hybrid thing.
Nonetheless, I just think it would be, if we're going to go through the process of doing regulations, just not tie ourselves to one specific type of hybrid. We don't even know. Staff asked if we knew, what type of hybrids are out there. We really don't. But with all the changes that are happening at school districts and all the changes from K-6 to a K-8, or the different types of challenges they're being faced with, I just wanted to leave it open enough to where we could, as staff, or staff could, use the regulations to help make those calculations or identify those type of facilities instead of having to come back to the board each time there's a different type that we're not sure how to work with. So it's just to really allow for more flexibility. That's all.
Yep.
Yeah, we would like to leave it flexible also, but we took a look at all the different types of facilities contained in our regulations that we can offer under use of grants, and it seems like this is the only combination where we'd have trouble distinguishing between the space and where it's separated, where it cuts off, where it starts. The other ones are pretty clearly delineated. If you're going to combine, say, an admin facility and a library, I think it'd be pretty easy to separate where the two break. So we didn't feel like, we did take a look at this. We thought about this. We thought about including other types of combinations, but we just didn't really come up with any that we thought we wouldn't be able to distinguish otherwise.
So, Brian, it's more about where you're feeling that you can draw the line in terms of distinguishing those square footage amounts.
Yeah. The idea is to, we assign a square footage amount for each of these types of facilities. So we thought it'd be easy to do that. It'd be clear where to draw those lines if it was other types of facilities versus a gym multi. We appreciate your comments, though, for sure. Yeah.
Paul?
Well, I hate to muddy the water, but I've built a lot of admin library buildings, and usually there's meeting rooms, and they could be used either for a library or they could be used for admin. So why wouldn't you have just as much trouble there as you would separating a multipurpose room from a gymnasium?
We could take a look at each project case by case. There could be, I don't know, any number of combinations. There could be probably 20 different combinations or something you could look at, and we didn't think it'd be necessary to go through and pick a square footage amount or discuss a square footage amount for each one of those combinations when we thought maybe we could probably be able to tell in almost every other case.
And also another thought too is that when a district is building a brand new school, we wouldn't look at this chart at all. So we're talking about a very narrow universe, and we came up, like Brian said, 20 different combinations with maybe even variations of what's existing and what's not, and it became so much more complicated. So we're definitely open to having other types in there, but when we looked at how much effort it would go into trying to define every different type of scenario versus the likely universe of projects, it seemed pretty unlikely. Because again, if it's a new school, they're just using pupil grants, we don't even look at this chart. They build what they build.
So, any other comments? Yeah, oh, you guys, could you take us through attachment B just for a minute? And, yeah, and C. But which one should we start with? B? You guys are helpful today. Actually, before we do, could you introduce yourself to everyone?
Sorry, I'm late. My name is Robert Pierce. I represent suburban school districts.
Thanks, Rob.
Well, attachment B, as you see at the top, is from the facility hardship section of our regulations, but it is referenced in the use of grants regulations. So we use the square footages from this chart when we're doing use of grants calculations to determine what the state contribution would be. At the bottom of the page, you can see that we are looking at some proposed regulations to allow for the multipurpose room gymnasium hybrid, but we weren't really sure about the square footage. So what we've done here, just for a starting point for the conversation, is we've copied the square footages from the gymnasium in the chart above.
And are these square footages, are they minimums or maximums? What do they represent exactly?
There's a minimum and a maximum amount that we would fund.
Okay.
But there's also a per pupil square footage amount. So we would look at how many pupils are at the site and any additional capacity that's in the project and multiply that by the 12.9 square feet.
Okay. Dennis?
Yeah, I think it should be pointed out, I think this was brought up at the last meeting, that this is not, we think we hear minimum essential facilities and we think of design. This is actually what the state will fund. This isn't intended to be what is educationally the minimum essential. This is what the amount that the state will fund. So minimum essential facilities is kind of a misnomer in this case.
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we call them minimal essential facilities. There's that term's been debated, but what this chart is it's really, I think somebody came up and described it last time, and I thought it was a really good description. It's actually it determines the amount of funding the state can provide for that type of facility based on the number of pupils it's going to be serving. That's really what the chart is for.
And can someone tell me where the 12.9 square feet per pupil comes from? California Department of Ed? What's that? The number of the square feet per pupil amounts?
You made it up. No, the square footage per pupil, well, I think that was historically back when we first went through SB 50 discussions. I mean,
there's no old timers in the room that can tell us.
Yeah, I cannot go back that far. Sorry, Dave.
If I remember correctly, I'm not sure, but they just took in this case, a middle school sized gym, what you would need for a middle school sized gym, and the basketball courts, the volleyball courts, et cetera, and divided it by the number of students that would be typically in a middle school. I think that's how that came up.
Dave, can you?
It was actually based on
Mr. Zian, could you come up and use the mic, please?
Come on, Dave. You can put it now. Right here?
Yeah.
Dave Zian, representing OPSC. It was actually similar to what Dennis said, but it was a little bit different. And I was part of the original discussions with Jim Bush, who was with CDE at the time, the Director of Facilities. And so there were a lot of discussions. We took the original lease purchase program, minimum essential facilities charts. We did that calculation you talked about. We started there, and that was minimum essential in the old program, but it was amplified, and it was those numbers and those amounts that were in the original lease purchase program were increased. And I'm going to say it depended on what category, but there was a swing of about 25 to 40% increases. And that was where a lot of the discussion, it went on for months. So we increased it. So I just like to say that we use the minimum essential term. That's really a misnomer. It's an adequate school. And Jim was very concerned at the time, representing CDE at the time, that we not create a minimum essential. And he was a major proponent, and we heard him during those discussions. And this is early, before 2000. it was very important to him that we not create some minimal platform, that we provide an adequate platform for schools. So I don't know if that answers the question or not.
It does. Thank you. That's great. Lee?
Couple things. We've got at least 3 architects on this implementation committee. I'm wondering if you guys have looked at the square footage on this when Dave says this is adequate, what you guys think about that. And the second thing is, if we're really talking about, I guess I would ask staff, if we are really talking about what the state would fund and not square footage, why do we keep seeing these sentences, the square footage, blah, 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 shall not exceed the following? So do we need to have that statement in there about square footage? Could we say this is a guideline and this chart is about what the state will fund, rather than have that sentence in there and confusing people? Couple questions.
Yeah, we could, we can think about something like that. Consider that the reason it talks about minimums and maximums is it's the amount of funding that the state will be able to provide, a minimum amount and a maximum amount for that type of facility. And the way that we do that calculation, we use a square footage amount to determine the amount of square footage needed for the pupils, and then we kind of back into the grant. We take that square footage, we multiply it by a dollar amount per square foot. That's also in the regulations. It's updated with the construction cost index every year, like our grants. And then we come up with a dollar value, and then we divide the per pupil grant amount for the grade level being requested into that amount to determine the number of grants that they can request. And so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or not, but that's why it's based on square footage, is we kind of have to back into that per pupil grant amount.
I'm just wondering if we could say that more clearly on here, because I do think some districts might think, I can't build any more than this. And they may not want to build more than an 18,000 square foot gym for a high school. But instead, I like your explanation, and I get it, and I'm wondering if we can somehow put that into this, rather than say square footages shall not exceed the following.
We'll definitely,
it makes it look like you might penalize a school district, say you're overbuilding if you exceed.
Yeah, I think that was brought up last time.
Yeah, we'll definitely take a look at that. Thank you.
Dennis?
Lee, in answer to your question, excuse me, whether that's adequate or not, for a high school, a typical, the controlling factor would be a basketball court, and a basketball court would be 50 by 84. If you add perimeter, area for bleachers, circulation, et cetera, it comes out to be about 7,000 square feet just for the gymnasium floor. Now, if you add
bleachers, that's just a perimeter so that you're not crashing into the walls when you're playing basketball.
Right. But this says gymnasium with shower lockers. So, I think that's on the low side if you include the shower lockers, because you would probably be adding a couple thousand square feet on top of that for shower lockers for both the male and female.
Okay. So the line down at the bottom where it says OPSC proposed to amend the regulation and include the following so this is part of what's the proposed regulation change, right? This is essentially identifying a hybrid gym. But I mean, sort of going beyond your flexibility concern, Lisa, I think it is important for us to make sure this is probably the most common scenario, at the very least, the hybrid multipurpose room gymnasium, especially at the K-8 level. And so, are you okay with us with this as a chart or as a supplement to this chart, essentially, that gets inserted in this?
Yeah, we're fine with that.
Good. And then, is there any other, did you still want us to go over attachment C? Someone mentioned that earlier. Okay. Do you want to run through that, Valerie or Brian, whoever wants to do it?
The first thing that we would do when we receive an application that has a use of grants is we would determine if it was eligible to have a use of grants. And we do that by looking at the current CBEDS enrollment and the project capacity. We add that together and multiply it by the square footage from the chart in attachment B to come up with an appropriate square footage for that size, for that number of pupils. as you can see at the top of the page here, it is well below the minimum of 5,000 square feet. So we would give the minimum amount in this case. In example 1, using that minimum 5,000 square feet, we look at the square footage of the existing multipurpose at the site, and in this scenario, we've got 4,000 square feet. So that gives us a 80% amount, which is above the 60% minimum that's listed in the regs for a use of grants. In example number 2, we have the existing square footage of the multipurpose room at 2,970. So when we divide that by the 5,000 minimum that's allowed on the chart, then we get only 59%, which is below the 60% threshold. So this would qualify for a use of grants under the regulations.
And do you do the same calculation for gymnasiums, for any of the building types?
Any of them. We would just look at the amount on the chart in attachment B.
Okay. Yes.
Maybe I'm very confused on this, but isn't this the issue that the school district had, was they were asking for an addition? It seemed to me they were trying to do something very efficiently, not asking the state to build an entire new gym. They just wanted to add on, and this example 1, it seems like, to me, from the ground, from the user, and that this would be an appropriate and needed additional square footage to make it usable, but under this it still doesn't qualify. So were we addressing that as well to address that school district problem?
Go ahead.
You're correct. The item we took, they had an existing multi-purpose room, and it was above the 60% number. And that was the reason why it became an appeal, is because we said your multi-purpose room is, by our regulations, it's determined to be adequate, so we can't give you use of grants funding to expand it or build a new MPR. We did say you can build a new separate gymnasium building. The board approved the appeal, and they asked us to come back and take a look at the specific issue of having a combination facility, a hybrid facility, what we're calling it now. And so, yeah, that was the original issue that caused the appeal, I guess you could say, is that we deemed it to be an adequate building, and they couldn't use of grants for it. But the board's direction was more specific to addressing K through 8 facilities that have shared functionality.
Okay.
Can I ask a question, Bill?
Sure.
And I'm sorry if Brian answered this earlier. So I know there's a point at which not only you cap the size of what the building can be, but isn't there also a cap on the number of grants you can use? And if so, how does that cap determined? And I think you may have mentioned earlier, I just missed it.
Yeah, it's kind of the same thing. So let's say, like in Valerie's calculations examples here, we determine it's eligible to be reconstructed or expanded, and we determine the number of square feet that we can fund, and then we do that calculation where we multiply that by the per square foot amount. You get that whole number, and then you divide it by the per pupil amount, and whatever number that comes up with, that's the maximum amount of grants. So we turn the maximum amount of square footage we can fund, I guess you could say, into the maximum amount of grants we can allow to be requested. Does that make sense?
So you get to the number of grants based on the square footage allowed?
Yes.
Based on the square footage.
Yes.
So my question kind
Per
of...
square foot amount.
Yeah, but how do you get from square footage to dollars?
You divide it by the per pupil grant allowance of the grade level that's being requested. So if they're building a high school gymnasium and we say you're eligible for 12,000 square feet of gym space, we'd multiply 12,000 square feet times the per square foot amount in the regulations. That would come up with a number, and then you take that number and divide it by the high school per pupil grant amount, and that will give you the maximum number of grants you can request.
So you divide it by the 15.3 square feet per pupil for how many grants you can use?
You'd multiply...
Or divide it, excuse me.
Well, you'd multiply 15.3 times, say there's 1,000 kids at that school, and that gives you the square footage amount. And then you take whatever that number is and you divide it by the per pupil grant amount for high school or middle school or elementary school.
So given that, I mean, there really are, gosh, there's really 3 caps when you stop and think about it, because you're limited to the size of the school that you're operating at the time, you're limited to the maximum size of the MEF per attachment B, and you're limited to the number of grants kind of based on all of that. It's one of those things, why do we really care so long as if the district's combining 2 MEFs in one facility, so long as they're not exceeding the number of grants they can request for those 2 or 3 or however many they're combining, why do we limit it? Especially I think someone mentioned, it may have been Lee, they're being more efficient, they're building ultimately a less costly facility and combining it. It just seems to me that if they're not exceeding any of those caps.
Well, and I think that's why we're here. The board recognized that the way the regs were currently set up and to a certain extent the way the regs were being interpreted by OPSC, because of the lack of a clear definition in the spaces and their inability to sort of see without the lines what the additional space was separate from an existing multipurpose room. So I think we are here to give the flexibility and get to that point. Yes, sir.
Well, if I understand this correctly, your examples on attachment C were for multipurpose only and not the hybrid gym.
Correct.
And I'm kind of struggling with how really the added sections down at the bottom of page 7 really change anything. That's just the same as the gymnasium up above. One specific question would be, when you're figuring using the 12.9 square foot per pupil, if you have a K-8 school, which is typically when you'd have the hybrid, if you're only using the middle school students in that, you would almost always come up with a minimum of 6,828, simply because there's generally a much smaller number of 7th and 8th grade students in a K-8. Which tells me that you'd always come up with a minimum size, which doesn't seem to be really too adequate for a gymnasium plus food service plus shower lockers. That seems very, very small.
Well, we simply inserted the gymnasium figures as a starting point.
Yeah, she did say that.
We didn't know what kind of square footage to allow for the hybrid, so we thought we would start here and then get some input from the committee.
Okay. Yeah, my input would be that it's too small.
And I would second that, because in order for there to be even a perimeter around the basketball court, so that you're not bumping into the walls as you're going out of bounds, you need about 7,300 square feet just for the basketball court.
All right, well, let me just play the devil's advocate for a second here. Because remember, what we're talking about here is a facility where you're not just playing basketball, but you're basically having lunch in there too. Okay, so you're serving lunch in, presumably out of a kitchen and area, and yeah, no, I got it. So, but I guess you could make the case that the lunch serving area was essentially the same space as the gym, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So does it have to be bigger than a gym?
It needs to be as big as a gym.
Well, it needs to be as big as a gym. Okay, I got it. And then it needs to have the other.
The main room that
Right.
we're talking about, and then the auxiliary functions of the shower and locker and the kitchen need to be added onto that.
Right.
Well, and then we can ask the question again: do middle school children shower? We know the answer: no. Okay, sorry.
But that's a district choice.
Moot. You still have to build it.
Should be
And
a
they
state
do change-
mandate.
Do you have to build it?
Yeah.
And they do change clothes, even if they don't shower.
Thanks to Lisa, we still have to build it.
Thanks to Lisa.
Thanks to Lisa,
wants to blame
representing
kids.
Fred Yeager. It is still part of Title V. We understand that there's a reality that, middle school children aren't going to shower, but it's still part of Title V. at this time.
So, I mean, I was only, I was just trying to say, hey, is this a job for the California Department of Education to work on? I mean, wouldn't it be appropriate for you guys to take a look at the square footage to sort of make sure and do some brief analysis and work with OPSC staff? Our current plan in terms of where we are with this item is we'd like to bring back a final regulation at our next meeting so we could then take it to the board. But I think, I mean, I can appreciate the discussions about the square footage and what's right, but, and this was essentially a placeholder in terms of the square footages that are here for an example on the item. We don't know what the right number is. Yes, Eric?
I second that. I am still a little troubled with the focus on the square footage. It doesn't seem like that's the problem here. The problem seems to be the 60%. When you deal with the hybrid, and I think we're kind of focusing on the wrong thing a little bit. Because I look at this, we can change the square footages all we want. I don't know if this particular school district would have been served by the change. And I think it seems to be simple in the fact that the 60% caps the ability to provide the dual function, single facility concept that the school is trying to promote. And I think we need to look at that as the real resolve to this problem, not necessarily the square footage. I wouldn't mind having Lisa work on that issue still, but I still think the focus really needs to be that if you are a school district it's creating a hybrid type situation to avoid what the program would allow is building just a complete other facility, and the district is trying to be efficient, save money, and try to just expand its current facility. That's not going to happen if we're still stuck with the 60%.
Okay,
and I think that needs to be the focus of this conversation.
Let me just make sure. I think we do need this piece of the chart that allows these hybrid facilities.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't disagree.
That's one part, and we need to define the size. But I think you're probably right. So if a district comes in and they already have, so the 60% issue, are they going to get, if they want to build a hybrid facility and their multipurpose is already adequate, that's the problem.
And I think all we really have to focus is to create an exclusion for those districts that are planning and designing to expand their existing facility to save both, space on probably a very small school. I look at my school districts that are very small in urban settings. I don't have the ability in some cases to just go out and build a new gymnasium if that were the case. I would prefer to try to expand what I already have to maximize the space I have on a limited school site. So I think we have to be able to accommodate that, and I think there's some flexibility. I think we all agreed that we want to create flexibility.
Let Mary go.
Okay.
So, thank you. Mary?
I would agree with Eric that hard, bright line at 60% is really a problem, because if you're at 59.9%, so sorry, too bad. And because the issue really ought to be about educational adequacy, and that lies with CDE, frankly, not with OPSC. And should they be able to do something that makes sense for them in supporting their educational goals, and it falls within line of the regulations of them being able to spend money? I don't know why we would tell them no.
Well, and just so you know, the appeal that we're talking about that was the base of this coming here was partially resolved by working with CDE. And if you remember the history, they had initially said, well, it's a multipurpose room, but then when they looked at it again, they said, yes, it is a hybrid facility, and it uniquely meets the educational needs. And part of OPSC's job is really to have other agencies tell them, yeah, this is okay, and kind of did just what you said, reflected the flexibility in that case.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Dennis? And then
I think one of the key issues here is the fact that it's a conversion, where you started out with a multipurpose room for a K6, K5 configuration, and now this is being converted to a K8 configuration. I think that could be one of the triggers, rather than having the 60%, where you had, yes, you've got a multipurpose, and yes, it's 60% or adequate for a K5 configuration, but it's not adequate for a K8 configuration, regardless of the 60%. So I think that conversion factor could be one of the triggers. If they're going from an elementary school to a K8 model, then you don't have to meet that 60%. You just convert it to a hybrid multipurpose gymnasium.
Makes sense. Yes.
And probably this was already explained, but I probably missed it the second time. Where did the 60% come from again, and where is that located?
Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was the same place that Dave was talking about earlier, where the square footage amounts came from. I think it was part of that original model.
So it's interpretation, staff interpretation, not something in policy or statute.
Well, it's in
regulation. Okay, but it was devised at that same time. Okay.
That's my understanding.
Lisa.
And Bill, I was just going to say, I mean, we're more than willing to work with staff before the next implementation committee. I think my concern from the department's perspective is that we are, as Mary mentioned, we're about the educational adequacy, and we're about how this is going to work within the program of that school or of that district, or how this now new facility is going to play into that program. So, and I know that we've had this discussion, we've talked about complete schools and whatnot, but it's going to be difficult for us to tie into a square footage amount in those terms, because our role is a little bit more about what the educational program is and how that facility is going to meet it. But we're more than willing to work with staff and see if there's something we can come up with. I think our role is a little different in that regard, especially since we're tying this to state funding, and so we're trying to jam our role of educational adequacy into how the state is going to fund this portion of it. So I think we're more than willing to help, but it's going to be difficult in terms of how our role is in this program. So.
Yeah, I understand.
Bill, if
Yes.
I got skipped. So I'm still trying to understand. Is the issue for the project that brought this to our attention that they couldn't generate the eligibility for an MEF, or that they couldn't justify the use of the number of grants they wanted to use to build the new facility?
No, the issue was that their existing multipurpose room was adequate, and so it didn't qualify.
It was an eligibility issue. It was, you didn't qualify for the MEF funding program because
in that regard, yes,
your
that's
existing
sorry.
facility was deemed adequate, which is not a state allocation board or an OPSC issue. It's CDE that deems whether or not the facility is adequate. And it just, I hate to make it sound overly simple, but if it's a middle school and they have one building that they have made work as their multi, whatever that means, and their gym, whatever that may mean, they deserve to have two, just like everyone else in the state. And if they have one building that they've made accommodate both of those uses, it would seem that you would take the square footage for both facilities that they should have, that they don't have, total those together, and then run the 60% calculation. Mm-hmm. It just seems to arbitrarily harm a district because they have one big building that they've had to make work, and I would guess this building's probably 60 years old, if not older. So it was an eligibility issue. It wasn't, they weren't eligible for the program because a building they have was more than 60% of what we've deemed adequate.
Yes,
That's correct.
It was a two-part issue, though. It was the eligibility, but also the OPSC, the way the regs were set up, they couldn't recognize a hybrid, right? They wanted to see a wall, right? So that you could say, this is multi, this is gym. And so we're trying to solve that part, and maybe the chart on attachment B solves that piece to create the hybrid facility classification. And then the second part of this is the discussion of, the eligibility. So I think, Brian Odell, do you want to comment on that? You got that idea in terms of, I think it's a little bit of it's kind of moving the item forward just a hair, and I think that's a good discussion about including that piece also.
Just real quick, if this chart that we're proposing was in reg, it would have addressed the issue for the district. It would have worked. We ran the numbers, so it would have taken care of that. The problem comes if you look at attachment C with the mechanics, and if you look at example 2, it says square foot of existing MPR. So you have to take the square footage of the existing facility and then compare that to what's going to be the total square footage when they're all done. Well, we couldn't do that because with an NPR and a gym, the floor space is overlaps. And so they could have built a standalone gym. They would have qualified. It just didn't make any sense. They didn't have room. It didn't make any sense. It would have been more money for everybody, the district and the state. So that's why the board said, yeah, we don't have this scenario in regulation, but it does make sense. So we do have a reg that would address those types of their specific issues. So the question is, if we have this combined facility, if we just add it all together, we still have that overlapping because some of, if you think of an NPR room, you are going to have, maybe a small half basketball court or something like that. You expand it to a full basketball court, what happens? Well, the half basketball court is at NPR or gym. So now all of a sudden we've essentially doubled. Now we have these massive facilities, and that would sort of not really be in line with the board direction to just address those facilities.
I'm confused, honestly, though, based on what you said, Brian. I appreciate everything you said, except that the proposed table, if the proposed table works, then the existing table works, because the proposed table only has the word hybrid NPR / That's the only difference. The square footages are the same.
That would be my point as well. So all we just simply need to do is recognize if the school district's trying to build that type of facility, we just basically look at the chart to the largest of the two facilities that's in question here. Even to Paul's example, we look at either the school admin and the library space, and we can NPR and the gymnasium. We just simply apply the largest of the two and see if it qualifies. And I think we can make that happen.
And just so I better understand the situation, if the district had said one or the other, so the district said, we don't have an NPR or we don't have a gym, as opposed to we have both but neither one's adequate, they would have qualified to do one of the two.
Yes.
Okay. Just the building they had was too big to meet the 60% test for any one of those two facilities.
They had an existing NPR, actually. It was clearly a multipurpose room, what they had, and it was adequately sized for a multipurpose room.
It was just very large, too, and could
It was.
house a
I
gym
think
at
it
the
was.
same time?
I don't remember the exact number, but it was.
Okay.
Yeah, it was quite a ways above the 60% number.
And they were looking to expand it. That's the issue. So it's that new square footage.
Yeah.
That was.
And it was large because it was also being serving as their gym.
I don't know if we know that. I mean, they probably were. Yeah. The other thing too is this facility. Just another fact about that case. That facility was actually built with a false wall, I believe it's called, in order to provide future expansion at whatever time they needed it. So that was another thing that we considered in that appeal.
Forward-thinking district. There's a comment
So it wasn't
from
60 years old.
From the audience?
Good morning, Richard Gonzalez and Associates. I've happened to have pulled out recently, 2 or 3 weeks ago, the old lease purchase programs rules from the calculation of square footages. And it seems to me that one of those components was food service. The thing that stands out in here, and I think it's been kind of talked about a little bit here, is that the square footage that you're recommending for the middle school here is equivalent to the gym, but doesn't provide room for the food service. Okay, and I believe it's 2 square feet per pupil for food service, but I can pull that out. I can make that available to, if you wish it, and that could be something you can count on or consider in that scenario. Okay, if you're starting with trying to build one from scratch, a new multi-gym complex. However, in the case of when you have an existing multi and gym complex there, why can't it not just be as simple as saying, look, you already have the food service equipment and the food service area there. You have the floor of the multi-purpose room, which will count, but what we'll do is we'll compare it to the gymnasium computation for 60%. If it doesn't meet the gymnasium requirements, then we will build the added square footage for that space. But you also have to acknowledge that it's now a gym and not a multi-purpose room. And you can use it for both.
No, you acknowledge it's a hybrid.
But you can use it for both as a hybrid, but for purposes of this program, it's a gymnasium, which allows
you're
them
saying-
later to come back, and if they wanted to do a standalone multi-purpose building, they could, using MEF, if that expansion of the district should occur. Because if you then tell them that they have a gym multi-hybrid now, and this district grows by leaps and bounds, you're going to tell them you can't have either one because you have a hybrid. And I don't want to have that caveat being placed on a school district that just because you have a hybrid, now you can't come back into the future and ask for another building to serve a different purpose, when in fact the square footage was essentially calculated for purposes of a gym.
Richard, real quick, are you saying that right now they have a multi-purpose room that I'm going to make up numbers is 6,000 square feet, and they're going to build a gymnasium that's going to be 10,000 square feet if this goes through, that they shouldn't or couldn't maintain the same functions of the multi-purpose room within the size of the new gymnasium that's built into this program?
No, I didn't say that. I said they can do that. The state would fund the 4,000 square foot difference.
Right.
That's my recommendation. Okay.
By the way, I'm in agreement with you.
And then that would be considered a gym. But then if you keep it like this, then you're going to have the problem later. The district this campus has grown now. Instead of 500 kids, it's now serving 1,500 kids. And they need a multi-purpose room. And potentially the regulations don't address building a secondary multi because they have a hybrid that was funded by the state.
Can you think of a scenario where that would be necessary to build a secondary?
That's something else, though.
If it grew.
If it grew that much. But the other aspect of all of this is there are so many scenarios, potentially, we can't cover every single one of them in the regulations. Mm-hmm. There has to be some discretionary point in the staff to have made this decision. I thought that was available to them. They could say, all right, for our purposes right now, this is not a multi, this is a gym, does it meet the 60%? We'll give you the net difference in square footage. We don't need to have a separate regulation for it. I really thought that was within the authority of the staff to be able to make that kind of a decision, okay, where the state benefits and the district benefits. In the meantime, you've told this district, I'm willing to pay for a $10 million gymnasium for you, but I won't do a $2 million addition to your multi. Yeah. I'm sorry, you want to spend 10 versus 2? I just didn't make a sense from an administrative perspective. So I'm just sharing that that's two things to consider. One is if you want to do one from scratch, maybe you want to add a couple square feet for the per pupil for the food services or whatever the old rules were potentially. And secondly, just say, hey, for all intents and purposes, for this program, this is now a gymnasium. And I think that's what the board said. You can't come back later and tell us you don't have a gym.
Yeah, they did say that. You're right. There was another comment from the audience.
Ken Reynolds with Schoolworks. We actually worked with the district on this project, so I did have some clarifying information. And also, I've been working with the program for many, many years. A couple of other comments. First, when we're working with our districts out there, the word minimum essential facilities, I always took it to be not that these are the minimum size items, but at a minimum, you should have these categories of facilities. You should have, a place to eat. You should have a library. You should have a place for your physical education program. So I think that's where the word minimum came from. But secondly, this school is a small K-8 school, so it isn't converting from an elementary to a K-8, although I know a lot of projects that are going through that process and will have that challenge in converting a cafeteria into gym functionality, or if they have the space, obviously they would want to build a new gym. The other item is the district, I think, was going to be able to work. Many of the small districts I work with are able to make the numbers work. Obviously, when we start talking about the hybrid issue, as Richard pointed out, having a little bit of extra space for the kitchen facilities or either that or not counting it against them when you're running the eligibility question. And then the other item is the biggest challenge out there is working with that 60% formula. You know, if we're saying what adequate is what, if you're considered adequate, you're not allowed to use this program if you're above that 60% limit, I think is a real constraint. You know, in your example, you were saying a 5,000 square foot is what we would recommend for a small cafeteria, multi-purpose room. However, if you have a 4,000 square foot building, you know, don't look to us to help you out. Whereas if we got rid of the 60%, you know, you'd only be eligible for 1,000 square feet, so it's not much. So it's being a very limited exposure, but allows them to use some of the grants to expand that building to our 5,000 recommended square foot size. So I don't know if we have the ability to delve into that piece of the minimum essential facility regulation, but I think the key factor there is that 60%. Then the final item is on the regulation in terms of what to do with how this is categorized. I appreciate the comments from Richard on, you know, do we have 2 buildings, 1 building? So this hybrid category I think would work, you know, if we're, you know, I don't think the district had looked that far into the future on whether or not they should be precluded from having a second building, you know, down the road. That may be something we want to try to focus on. But if you have an adequate multipurpose, how do we allow districts to still qualify to add that gym functionality? Because currently this district, they do not use their current multipurpose building, even though it's adequate size for the cafeteria services. It doesn't provide their physical education program. The only opportunity they have for real physical education is the limited facilities they have outdoors. And again, down in the Central Valley, on days like this where it's well over 100 degrees, that's not really functional.
Do you have a comment? Or
I just have a question for you. You're saying that this has always been a K-8 school and it was originally designed and built as a K-8 school?
Yeah, it's just a small district. I said they probably started with only 100 kids, and they're up to, I think, close to 400 now.
It's the only school in the district.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Okay, so we're ready to wrap this one up? All right. So what I heard is that we want to, that the chart amendment makes sense, but that we want to make sure there's some interaction with CDE to confirm that we've got the square footages right, so we could maybe run some scenarios on what a building would look like in terms of the space and some of the standards. I mean, I liked Richard's input on the 2 square feet per student for food service. I'm sure you've got some other standards that you can help us with, or the SFP people can get to you. And then the second piece that I heard was the 60% calculation and how that gets made and what adjustments we do to make sure that we end up being able to allow a project like this to go forward and not get kicked out. So that seems like something we didn't totally have in here covered, but let's make sure we bring that in and include it in where we're going forward, okay? And then our intent is to come back next time with a reg package or just some minor updates and take this to the board. Okay? Anybody else want to? Did I miss anything? Okay, good. Don't all speak at once. Okay, 5-minute break. So let's go ahead and get started on our second item, and that is continuing improvements to the project information worksheet. And I just want to take you back to where we were before I turn it over to the staff. We had in previous months in March and April, February, March, and April, gone through a process of developing a series of improvements to the worksheet, including auto-population of project funding areas, auto-calculation, et cetera, and we had prepared an item to go to the board to adopt those short-term improvements. Subsequent to that, we were reminded by the chair that the original direction from the board was to streamline, and the other element that we had done is looked at which submittal to dropping one of the submittals for the PIW, and we were reminded subsequently by the board that the board chair, that the board's direction was also to look at not just streamlining, reducing number of submittals, doing auto-population, auto-calculation, but also looking at what it would take to add other program types than new construction to the PIW so that the state could have information and data collected on other areas of the school facilities program, the biggest example being modernization. And so in that background, we've been directed to not come back to the board until we have a complete package ready to go. And so that's why we're here today. And I'd like to ask staff to talk, and we want to talk about the issue of focus today. How do we, as a state, use this instrument to gather project cost and scope information on modernization projects and eventually other programs? But I think when Brian goes through the discussion, you'll see that a lot of what we're focusing on is going to be related to modernization or rehabilitation. And we have a scribe with us today, Jeremy McCarroll, from the Office of Public School Construction, against his will. But no, he's going to do it, and he's happy to do it. He's going to be providing note-taking services for us, for the thoughts that we might have on the program. So why don't I let Brian, and I want to note that Michael Watanabe is here for this item too. And Brian?
Thank you. If you turn to page 10, please, at the top, it lists the type of projects that the PIW is currently required for, and also the type of projects that it's not. It's required for all different types of new construction, with the exception of CTE. So whether it's funded under the ORG program, new construction, facility hardship, or charter school, if it's new construction, then it's required, generally speaking. A few exceptions, one of which would be if it's a modernization and there's an HPI grant provided, then the district would complete just the HPI page, essentially, for the PIW. What it's not required for is joint use, charter schools if it's a rehab, CTE if it's new construction, CTE if it's modernization, any modernization, the 57 projects, or facility hardship rehab. So if we think about real-world projects, you're either building something brand new or you're doing some work on something that's existing. So the thought process currently is, because most of the existing questions and information is focused on getting square footages for new stuff, that probably most of the other categories would be covered if we were to focus on the work that's being done to an existing facility. Modernization, rehabilitation, whatever it's called, but there's an existing building there or existing site and work is being done to it. So our goal today is to receive input and to try to say, what are the types of things that are being done, how is that information currently being tracked, and can we use some of those same processes or systems or categories to just mirror that as best as we possibly can for a brand new section of the project information worksheet. So rather than trying to take the new construction and tweak it so that it works no matter what type of project, just have another page or something, we're still open, that would work for different types of project scope. And ideally, if a district had a modernization project, they go online, they would fill it out. Only for the online worksheet, only the relevant sections would appear. wouldn't have to fill out something that was completely irrelevant. If there were some things that OPSC is already capturing, we would auto-populate that. So if that's possible, we'll look for every opportunity to do that. But we have on page 11 a list there, the second paragraph, the long list of bullets. That's just for discussion purposes. Those are the categories listed in the Ed Code for what qualifies for modernization work. And so below that we have some of the different types of project scopes. It could be like-for-like replacement, reconfiguration for educational purposes, roof replacement, window replacement, all these different types of things. So we're hoping to have an open mind and see what type of work is being done, how that information is being tracked, and have something that could easily be filled out.
So just to piggyback on that last statement, could easily be filled out. I think what we've talked about internally in terms of a concept is taking off a little bit on the discussion that we had previously related to auto-population, so that when a district goes online and puts in their project number, that the prefix number, the 50, 57, 54, whatever the correct numbers are, that would, once they input that number, the correct page for them to fill out related to the type of project would then they would go right to that. In other words, it would be a drop down that would take you right into the new construction, take you right into modernization, take you right into charter, or whatever it is, so that we can have it as simple and easy to navigate and fill out as possible. And the second piece is that I think the auto-population elements are extremely important in there, and when we look at cleaning up some of the areas of the PIW, including, for example, the high-performance page, we are looking at ways that we can even auto-populate that using information that we collect already on the HP1. So I think we're trying to figure out a way to do this, and I think we have the structure started with the work that we've done so far, that we can make it fairly simple and painless to fill out, or as painless as possible. How's that? But the point today, as Brian said, is for us to try and understand what information is it that the state does not have that we need from districts so that we can have accurate data regarding the work that's being performed using state bond funds. So obviously we don't have the construction cost. We don't have those kinds of things. So, and that's what we collect now on our new construction one. But that said, I want to throw it open to around the table. Yes, Lee?
Bill, and I really appreciate that the state would want this information, and I think it's good. What would be very onerous for everyone involved, the design team, a contractor, trying to get the information out of a contractor, the school district staff, would be to try to itemize each part or piece of the scope of the work and try to put a cost to it. Virtually impossible. And so while I'm very curious about that, I'd love to see data on that, but I think it would be virtually impossible for the school districts to provide that. So like the HVAC, we put in new air conditioning in wing A, B, and C in my high school, it costs this, this, and this. To try to pull that out of a hard bid or even a lease back situation I don't think we can get it.
And I think just to stop, I think it's a really good point, and it's not totally clear to me that from the big picture standpoint of data, cost data, bond accountability, et cetera, that we want to get that far in the weeds.
Good.
But I want to take it back one step, which is we probably do want districts to be able to tell us what was the scope of what you did with the modernization funds, and that's fairly easy, right?
Yeah. So I was just going to. I started off with the bad news.
Okay. Good.
So the good news to me would be, and what's really, really interesting, and of course what school districts forever have been saying to the state, no fault to the staff or anything, it's just how it's been, is we don't have enough money for modernization. I'm going to zero in on modernization. We never have enough money for modernization from the state. It's extremely ridiculous. The amounts of money used to be whatever it was per square foot, and now that can be eaten up, chewed up very easily with Americans with Disability Act improvements just by itself. So for all of my projects, we've gone way beyond what the state would call a modernization project, and many, many school districts do that. So I think that's the piece that's interesting is, well, of course, it pushes a point that the school districts, and I know that, that we've been saying it's not adequate what the state thinks is a modernization or a modernization grant or a modernized school. What does that mean? It certainly can't be paid for just by the state and the match. And so I think that's the piece that's interesting, and I agree with you, it's the scope. And then if, for us, we would often have well, here's what you could get if you just did the state modernization project. This is what it would look like. And my project might be just ADA improvements, and that's it on a really old school. Path of travel and everything else. Tearing up concrete from between every building, for example. So, but we don't want to just do that. So here's the extra scope. And then this is what we did to provide a, quote, modernized facility.
Great.
That's the interesting part for me to see. I don't know about the state.
It is for me, too. Thank you. Eric?
I think my light just went out up here. I appreciate the need and the interest to collect information, and we want to make sure that we provide the right information as we go through this. I've got a number of points. The first one is we still have yet to figure out what the right PIW should look like for the new construction program that we already do. I've said this when we first started this conversation, when I first got on this committee, that I think once we've figured out what the right questions should be and how and the amount of effort that school districts have to go through to provide that information, we've perfected that, then we should expand the PIW to other programs. But we are not there yet. We still have yet to get back to the conversation about what the current PIW is asking and if that information is necessary. A lot of the information I think is great in how we've kind of talked about populating, auto-populating, trying to streamline the process, which is great, absolutely great. I don't want to take anything away from that. But there's still some questions that are just what value do they provide? And we haven't even really got into those kind of questions. I don't want to start getting into developing a new PIW for modernization when we still have some outstanding issues with the new construction side. The second half of another point I have is that a lot of the volume of work necessary, sorry, I take it back. A lot of the work that most school districts, and at least in LA's case, has to do with modernization, the volume of work that we submit to OPSC. I mean, there's been times where we send 200 and 300 mod applications at a time. 100 here, 100 there is not uncommon. The point is that to then require that districts now fill out a PIW for every one of those applications, and on top of that, PIWs for all the new construction, which still is all very lengthy in time. We're going to need like full departments to fill out these forms. We're going to spend more time filling the forms out than actually building or planning any schools. I just think we just have to be cautious of how much effort and energy is going into all the information being requested to the point that we're not actually disincentivizing school districts even participating in this program. I think what we really need to do, and I've said this before, is we really need to sit down and say, what is the information we want going to provide us? How is it going to be used? And why do we even want it? I think we've kind of lost track of why we even started this process. When the PIW was created, it was based as a tool to determine whether or not the 6% grant increase, was going to be necessary. Then it was expanded to become accountability and transparency. Then it was expanded to become something else and something else. I don't think you can have everything in this one form. And I think we need to sit down and kind of figure out what is it that the state really wants in moving forward. Does the state just simply want cost information about how much does it cost to acquire property in Los Angeles versus Contra Costa versus Central Valley? Does the state need to know what it costs generally is to build an addition project versus a new construction project. That information is there already. It's in the grant information. It's in our 5005, 5006s, whatever the form is. But then to add in modernization, all these other programs, I think you're just now getting in the weeds. Like, how much does it cost for an HVAC system? How much does it cost to put in low voltage wiring? I mean, I don't know if the state really cares to know how much it costs for wiring. So these are value questions. I think we need to have at least the state at the leadership level really needs to figure out what they want, because otherwise we can spend years just providing useless data and wasting lots of school district resources that will end up costing everyone a lot of money and time to produce nothing. And so I'd really like us to sit back and really figure out what it is that we're trying to accomplish. That's my 2 cents.
Can I just not respond, but to sort of piggyback on your comments? I totally agree with you that we're not. It can potentially be a lot of work, and we can continue to ask ourselves, what are we going to do with this data? But I think that the overriding question that it seems to me that the state wants to know, and that's an interest for every school district in California. What does it cost to build a school? You can't tell me. I mean, you can't tell me that answer, right? You can tell me on a local basis, but you can't tell me what it costs in a county by area, what it costs for an addition versus a full site. It's important information for state decision makers to have, and we're not going to get it from cost estimates from architects or engineers or individual districts. The information may be there on a 5005, but the way that those documents work and the items are reported to the state in those documents doesn't really lend itself to an analysis that would help us to say, what does it cost per square foot to build a school, project cost, facility cost, what does site acquisition cost, what does it cost per student? And I think if we have the data and analyze it, we get some fairly surprising results when we look at it. And so the fundamental issue for me is that it is in the state's interest, and it's in every district's interest, to know what it costs to build a school. And that's the fundamental data that the state doesn't have. Okay? And you can say that it may come in some other forms. Some of it does. But what the PIW does is ask, okay, what did you actually spend to build this school? All of your costs. And it's data that doesn't get reported on a 5006, as everyone knows, because you just report what your match is maybe, or not all of your grant, all of your amounts. So I think the fundamental question we're trying to ask is, what does it cost to build a school? And it's, some of the subsets are, what were the funds available versus what were the costs? What was the state share versus the local share, et cetera? Yes, sir.
County schools met yesterday, so we had a good chance to talk quite a bit about the project information worksheet and came up with 5 suggestions. One, we need to make sure the new regulations only apply to fund future bonds and not complicate the existing bond authority. Number 2, need to simplify the overall form to compare cost data. And
so say that one again.
We need to simplify the overall form to compare cost data.
Okay.
I mean, we've got on there decision of whether we're providing a softball diamond or a baseball diamond. I mean, that's really not helping. Item number 3 is to identify the gross components of a complete school, so that we can identify which gross components are being provided. Particularly, this is a new school construction, so that we can compare the cost data. Because there's a big difference between whether you're building all classrooms or you're building a complete school. So if we identify what are the components of a complete school, then when projects come up and they're building classrooms, we can and define it in gross component terms. So particularly with the modernization, it would be really quite cumbersome to break it down even further on a modernization level, talking about, are you doing lighting, other than to do it, like you said, Bill, as a description, and that would be a reasonable request. You could say you did HVAC and electrical upgrades or you did just carpet and cabinets on a descriptive basis. But if you were going to break it down on numbers, that would be really tough.
So you're making the same point that Lee made initially. Okay.
Absolutely.
On that one.
And you chimed in on that. Item number 4, need to further reduce the number of submittals. When you're talking about modernization, now you are in a situation where you're really not getting the right numbers until you get to the end of the project. And even necessary,
because of the higher likelihood of change orders, is that what you're saying?
And the possibility of eliminating the scope also, because your money may only take you through the ADA upgrades and not get you to all the other things that you want to accomplish. So we moved to 3 to 2. So if this month we move from 2 to 1, and we go 1 to 0.
You're looking for progress.
Just a thought.
Submittal reduction progress.
And the last one, need to consider allowing schools an opportunity for moving to the electronic age and with a new bond, considering uploading a picture of what was accomplished, whether it's new construction or modernization. That's what they do with the stormwater pollution prevention program, especially since OPSC staff is not allowed to get out and review the completed projects as much as they used to. So upload a picture, possibly a little snapshot of the overall project cost. You get the picture with the overall project cost right there, and then even possibly a link to the specifications for the project if anybody wants to delve further into what got accomplished. So electronic age, just a suggestion. And if you want to do that instead of the whole PIW, we're really in favor of that. So those are suggestions from county schools.
Rob?
I don't want to echo everything that everyone else has said, but I would agree with that. And maybe in the picture, hold a copy of the paper for that day so you know it's actually real. Isn't that what they do to verify that it's real?
Date stamp it.
You know, I think we're hearing a lot of the same things, and Lee used the word interesting a lot, and I know this will sound very negative, but I'm not interested in doing a lot of work for something that's interesting. If I knew what it was being used for, and I've submitted a lot of PIWs so far. I don't know what they're being used for. I don't know if they've even been used at all. And
we're looking at them. Don't worry.
In a district, my facilities department has been cut by probably 3/4. And so at some point, knock on wood, hopefully in the future, we'll start growing again. And with the number of projects that we'll have, I'm going to have to hire staff just to deal with the PIW. So if I knew exactly, I know what the dream is, I know what we're talking about them being used for, but I don't know that they're being used. So I get really scared when I start thinking of expanding it into modernization. Again, not to reiterate, but for the same reasons, I still don't believe it'll give you useful data for new construction. Those issues are magnified exponentially for modernization in terms of what I think the purpose of the PIW is going to be used for. And the other frustrating part is, the data is already out there. Granted, it's at 3 different agencies, maybe more, but all the infinite data is there. I mean, even DSA and OPSC with the application for funding has the intimate details of what's included in the project. And we're being asked now to extrapolate that into a meaningful term that anyone at a desk can understand what's in those plans and specifications, and it's adding additional work to the districts. One thing might just be simply to require, and I know I'll get some boos in the room perhaps, but make us report every expenditure. Don't allow us to just report up to our match on the DLOP. Make us that's an attachment to the 5006. I know everyone. Yeah, see, Eric turns my mic off. That's why your light stopped working. That's something that if you have your systems in place already, we can run reports, and it's not that difficult to run a detailed list of project expenditures in-house if your systems are in place. So, require us to report all those, because that's the attempt of the PIW, right, is to see everything we spent, not just what we reported.
Yeah, that is the intent, yes.
So I think I'll shut up for now. Thank you.
Further comments on this side?
As an architect, I've worked on modernizations that run the gamut. I mean, in recent years, I've modernized an elementary school, and it cost $25 million, and I'm modernizing one right now that costs $1.7 million. How much does modernization cost? you can't answer it from those two examples. So I think, Bill, there is something to be said for having a description of the work associated with what you are doing, but if every project has a unique description, then again you run into the impossibility of comparing. If every piece of data is unique and you can't run any systematic analysis of that, what you will find is that, gee, some people are spending a lot and some people are spending only what they can afford to spend, given the state funding and their minimum required match.
Dennis?
Well, I told myself coming into this that I was going to be quiet on this issue because I have been a strong opponent of PIWs for all the reasons that have been stated so far. And one of the things, building on what you said, Bill, it's important to have the cost data, but we're not anywhere near there yet. And yesterday afternoon, I spent some time and tried to, if this is for accountability, who is it accountable to? Who is a program accountable to? Is it the government and they have limited access to the data? Is it the voters, where the data should be out there? And I know in the past we've said that this data is available somewhere, but it's very difficult to find. I spent some time yesterday afternoon doing web search, primarily on the OPSC website, trying to find out where this data is and what kind of data is available. And I came up with some very nice charts. I think they're excerpts from the State Allocation Board packets, but they're basically very general charts that don't have any specific information on. They don't even have any information on costs. The one that I could come up with, part of the website that had, I think, specific information on the PIWs that have been submitted. I tried to get in and access that information, and I kept getting error messages. I could not get into that particular segment. I could not find anything on the website that specifically directed me to information that what you were talking about, Bill, on cost information for schools. So the question is, we've been collecting this data for how many years now, and what purposes has it been used for? There's a tremendous amount of district staff time, Eric, as you were saying, and Robert, you were saying, you've got staff time, budgets are being cut, you don't have time to do this information. What is this being used for? What's the point in doing all this? Why should we be expanding it when we haven't figured out how it's going to be used and what good the information is going to be? And I've said my piece. I'll be quiet now.
Okay, is everybody done? I'm sorry, Lee, go ahead.
I'm not going to defend my interesting comment. And then butt splice now. No, but I guess I'm a data freak person, so I like data, and I think it is important for, I am looking at it from a district's point of view. I believe that, I think it's really good work that we're doing here, that we help inform and help develop what the PIW looks like. I think that's vital from the end user's point of view, and all the comments that everybody's made are very valid. I think that, Bill, when you say the state wants to know this, and this, and I look at this sheet and I go, well, okay, well, it's on this first sheet. Why do this sheet and this other thing and the other thing? It just feels like if you just, and I know, and we keep trying to be obstacles here, Bill, and I do appreciate your position. You've been told by the board to also look at expanding it to other programs, so I appreciate that, and I don't think that we're going to get anywhere without kind of at least thinking about it. Is what I'm hearing from you.
That's correct.
So I guess what I'd love to, if we have to do that and bite the bullet on it, then I'd like to simplify all of it and go back, what Eric was saying, what Rob's saying, everybody's saying, is that get to the essence of what you want and don't go into this square footage. The second sheet just drives me nuts. I mean, softball, baseball.
Actually, I want to, well, just let me stop there because,
sure.
You know, I have an analysis of PIW data that I'm working on, and I've done over 75 projects that are easily available on the website. You pull them right down. Anyway, well, maybe you're not a good computer user. But anyway, I'll be happy to show you. I'll be happy to show you how to do it. But the second page is actually critical. Square footage of the project is key information. The number of pupils served is key information. You have to have those two pieces of information in order to calculate the cost per pupil for the project or the construction cost. You have to have them to calculate. No, but it's, I mean, you're right. Okay, sure, you could say don't put all the different types down. The number of classrooms is very critical information. So I'm going to just defend the second page for a second. Does it still need a little work? Yes, it still needs some work. I'll give you that. And I, just so you know, I have and continue to represent the position that you're all expressing, which is we still need to do work to clean up the existing form, okay? And in all the venues that I'm in, I still say that, and I believe that we will get there. I believe that the board wants a complete package that includes cleanup of the existing form. So anyway, that said, our direction right now, for this meeting especially, is to look at modernization and what if we were to try and figure out what is the information about modernization that we as the state and districts want to collect and be useful, and what's the easiest way we can do it. So hopefully we can take a few minutes to do that, have that discussion. Michael?
Yeah, I think you brought back pretty much what I was going to say. I don't want to go around the room and address each member's comments, but bring it back to why we're here today. And our directions from the board and the chair is to expand to other programs. And what we're looking to do here today is to expand into the modernization program as a clean slate. We've heard over the last several meetings what the concerns are with the existing form for capturing new construction data. We're not here to edit that at this moment. We're here to expand to modernization as a clean slate. So what we're seeking the committee's input on is how do we collect that data? Lee, I've heard that it may be difficult to break out the project components. I don't know that I totally agree with that. I came up on the fiscal side of our office. I've seen a lot of continuation sheets from contractors that have broken down roofing for their mod project, paving, painting, each individual component. Now I realize ADA is actually a difficult one to capture, but I've seen plenty of continuation sheets with that. So I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, but if it is difficult, how do we collect the data we need to show for our end goal of potentially transparency, potentially for data analysis? We don't know what the end goal is, but if we don't have the data, we can't do anything.
So, Mr. Bakke?
That's the problem. If you don't know what the end goal is, then what's the purpose of collecting everything under the sun? It's just wasting our time. If you know what you want, we'll give you what you want. Just spare us the effort that we have to go through to provide you everything.
Well,
that's the frustration you're hearing from me and other school districts.
And I totally I hear you.
And that's why I keep speaking to the point that we need to determine what the value of the information collected is, because if we don't do that, we're fishing, and we have no idea what we're going to catch.
So let's take a second and decide what the goal is. If we're gathering information related to modernization, what would the goal be? And you said it when you started. So,
Bill, why don't we need to know from you, from the SAB, what is it they're interested in, and then we say what's the easiest way for you to get that information?
Okay,
because we would give you a different answer than probably they would.
No, actually, I think you'd probably, if you really are thoughtful about it, I think you'll probably get the same answer. So what I think the goal is, what the heck, is first of all to understand the total amount of money that a district spends on a modernization project. We don't have that data in any other form. Okay, so that's one. Cost. Okay, so can we agree that, and I'm getting to the next part of it, okay? It's as Mary said, she spends 25 million or she spends 2.5 million. This is all about scope. So we need to have the cost information, and it needs to be paired with the scope so that we can understand what it costs to modernize at various levels, and then compare that to the funding that's received by the state. And because what we're trying to get at is, eventually, still the main goal of the PIW when it was initially set up is the state's grant for modernization adequate to fully modernize schools? Now, we all think we know the answer already. I've modernized a lot of buildings, and I know the answer already, but I'm not saying. But don't we want to understand how much you spent on a project and what you did? And there's some simple and easy ways to collect that, and then compare that to the amount that was received by the state. Am I off base or not? Okay.
I think it's much more difficult than that, because with new construction, a lot of things are relatively clear, and you're starting with a clean slate, and you know what types of things have to be done. However, if you were to try to quantify, for instance, mitigation of dry rot, which is one of the things that happens during modernization projects. How do you, if you put a check mark down on a form that says, yes, we mitigated dry rot, does that mean that the buildings were crumbling down and you had to rebuild them from the ground up, or does it mean that there's a couple of patches here and there? Same thing with ADA. When you have ADA issues on the site, how do you quantify that type of issue?
What do you mean when you're saying quantify?
Well, you're saying dollars.
I wasn't saying dollars. I heard Michael say dollars.
But you're saying scope. If you put down scope as being ADA accessibility issues as a description, you can put that down. What does it mean? If you tie that to square footage, like you're saying, or to students, what does, it's so variable from site to site. You're collecting data, but what is it going to mean when you've collected that data? How are you going to put it into some meaningful report that is cost per student, cost per site, cost per district, whatever it is, when the variables are so great?
Yep. Okay. No, that's a good point, actually. Okay.
Bill, I still think that there, like you said, there is a combination of both quantitative and qualitative data that could be provided, and I think it would be useful. For example, all of us do a description. If we have a facilities program in our district, we do descriptions of the scope of a project for the public. I have a fact sheet. The simple bullets that go out. What did we do at this school? What did we do at this school? What did we do at this school? And how much did it cost? This is what we spent, but not on each item, not at all.
Okay.
I'm not agreeing with Michael at all. It's impossible to get that information. I think that would be useful, though, because of this issue of what does it cost. What would you have gotten if you just went with the state dollars? What were the state dollars? And then I get $2 million from the state, but I spent $25 million. Clearly, wow, I think that's useful to know. And the scope was what Department of Ed would say is now an updated 21st century school, or something close to it, trying to meet the requirements. And we all know what the first items are. I mean, any responsible architects looking at state requirements, at ADA, at DSA requirements, and then you go from there. And I think that's how most modernization projects are done, major ones anyway. And I think that you could also have a checklist, more or less, of did you do dry rot, minor, major, and maybe a little comment on it. Yeah, only in one building, very minor. Or you said, yes, major, in all of the wooden structures we found it. And just do it like that, just a little comment, but not tying it to dollar amounts at all, not tying it to change order amounts at all. And I think that you could, because I do it already for my for my program, for the public.
Sure.
I talk about scope.
So one of the things that I heard you say that I think is probably, in terms of if we were to do this, a methodology, is a drop-down checklist or menu of some kind that comes, so you modernized what was the scope of the work, okay? So you could it would drop down, give you a ADA at the top, and then when you clicked on ADA, it would give you another one that said path of travel, doors and hardware, blah, or whatever. You know, you could just check them, move along. Going back to the debate about cost breakdowns, I'm not sure that breaking down the cost by scope areas is data that's going to be that useful. Or it's kind of difficult to analyze at a big picture level. But anyway, so can I get a show of support? Let's see. for a checklist if we were trying to, I can see I'm not going to get it, but I'm not going to get it, but that's okay. Wouldn't you agree, if you weren't already mad? Let's see. I mean, it strikes me that, and I've given this a little bit of thought, that a checklist or a series of drop-down menus that are essentially in a checklist-type format to provide a description of scope might be a fairly simple way to accomplish this, but I'd love to hear if there's another way. Paul?
There's usually a description on the face of the documents by the architect telling what the scope of the modernization work includes, and I'd like to see something, just a description like that, rather than any checkbox or something, because
How do you input that data?
because you just draw it out, and I would leave it up to whoever's doing this elaborate analysis. Let them sift through my description and pull out what they want, because
I'll share with you though. I spend a lot of time on the web looking at data, and I often look at DSA's website. Right, if you go through if you start at OPSC's website and you click on a project number for a school project, and there's a variety of options available for you there, but one way you can go is you can end up at the DSA website and you can look at the description of the scope of work. Worthless. Impossible to determine what was done. And I've filled out many of those, so I know they're worthless. Or you use shorthand and you abbreviate and you just sort of get it over with. I think it would be far more accurate to use a very simple checklist type piece of information rather than having to have someone who's looking at this from afar and analyzing it try and interpret a descriptor, a paragraph about what you say is the scope.
the problem with the box that you're talking about is now you're putting weight to the various items. And you may say, oh, okay, I did some flooring removal, but it may represent only 1/100th of the process, whereas the bulk of the work was HVAC removals or something like that. So what you're describing, Bill, is called streamlining, and that's what we're supposed to be doing.
Paul, I like that issue of ascribing weight to something. Is maybe I did 10 square feet of flooring removal, but it's going to have now equal weight as everything else on the checklist. I think while a checklist might work in some cases, like it might be very accurate for this $1.7 million modernization I'm doing right now, that $25 million modernization I had included converting the existing cafeteria to a library because the current library was too small, and then building a new cafeteria. And that's not likely to show up in a checklist anywhere because the number of options that you have to start looking at is incredible.
You're right. And I think one of the areas that we talked with staff yesterday or a couple days ago when we were writing the item is this issue of educational reconstruction, reconfiguration. When you're doing big modernizations, that's a really important part of what you do to make a school really work for the next.
And within that, we added a lot of classrooms. The school didn't qualify for new construction money, but that doesn't mean they didn't have increased enrollment and need more classrooms. So how does that work into a modernization calculation?
Brian?
I I have a question. This is really interesting. Thank you very much. What can be quantified? Not necessarily the dollar so much, but I'm just wondering. We're talking about HVAC work as the scope. Is it easy? Is it already easy for districts to pull out the number of units installed, the size, things like that, the classrooms, how many were touched?
Well, not that easy per se, but let's go back to the first question you asked and get away from how many HVAC units for a second. What can be quantified and what's key, it strikes me, again, is the same thing as key with new construction. The square footage of the modernized area, right? Because we're going to, if you're analyzing the data, you're going to perform a calculation that says, how much modernization funds did I spend per square foot, right?
But that doesn't take into account ADA, exterior.
Okay, so I hear you, but it is a key element of this. But you're right. So there's a second piece, which is site work, right? That seems like it's a pretty important part of this. Yes. But is everyone so let me, I know we're not happy, but is everyone in agreement that we need to, if we were designing a data collection system, that it's important to have the square footage of the modernized buildings?
Question.
Yes.
How would you define the modernized area? If you're doing, for instance, if you're doing a campus where you're doing major work, replacing flooring, wall surfaces, ADA, doors, everything in one building, but you're only doing HVAC in other buildings, would that be the square footage would be the entire area of the campus?
Well, I would just add,
really
if you do HVAC, are you basically saying to the state that square footage has been modernized?
Yeah.
Just because you only did HVAC? Right. Or are you dealing with now low voltage wiring? Are you dealing with, lead abatement? Are you dealing with asbestos? Are those independently going to be treated? I guess it gets back to the value. I mean, does the state want to know how much square footage we modernized, but then layered that square footage by the various modernization projects? Or do you want to know how many HVACs have been replaced in the state of California?
I think that...
I don't know what the answers that we're trying to achieve here.
Let's imagine that you or I were working at the state level and we were looking at the data. If we knew the amount of square feet that were analyzed and the amount spent, we could determine the amount that the district spent per square foot, and we could have a good understanding, I think we could.
That's the problem.
Hold on.
You wouldn't.
Why not? Sure you would. So if you spent $12 a square foot and you just did HVAC or just did doors and hardware, versus if you spent, West Contra Costa, we used to spend $250 to $300 a square foot. That's a clear indicator of a significant reconstruction level scope, versus $12 a square foot, clearly inadequate to extend the usable life of the buildings. So I think with some of this data, you can make some very good determinations that helps the state understand what kind of shape are the buildings in, what did it cost to do them, what's the investment that might really be needed in order to extend the useful life of the buildings.
And this is...
trying to take this to the higher level here,
but
guys.
This is my fear in using the PIW information, is that it will be misinterpreted because there are so many variables that are involved, not just with the modernization, but with new construction. And if you try to generalize all this data and put it into categories, like just coming down to a cost per square foot on the different type, it is incorrect. The assumptions that you get from analyzing that data are not correct, and particularly with modernization.
I'm not sure I agree with you. So I don't think they have to be incorrect. If you're careful about what you do and you really consider how you're analyzing the data.
I think the worry here underlying all of this is that if all a school district can afford to do is spend $12 a square foot and do their HVAC and their ADA work, that when they're done, the state considers that they have been modernized. And that's the underlying problem. If that's all the money buys, then then that's all the money buys, but that this idea that you have modernized this school and it's done for another 30 years is the...
I think that I think that the legislature and the governor and the people that are going to put a bond on the ballot are smart enough to understand that if you spend $12 a square foot to modernize a school, it's not going to last another 50 years or 25 years, okay? But I think that that's the useful... I actually think it's clearly in school districts' interest to have the information about potentially, and I'll say it in the way that you're saying it, the limited nature of modernization that can be done with the state grant. Because, and if we're not collecting this and we don't have an understanding that you're giving me a grant to do this, to modernize a school, and I can't modernize it again for 25 years, right? And I was able to spend $25 a square foot as a construction professional, former construction professional. I can tell you that $25 a square foot does not modernize a school adequately to have it last for 25 years. Okay, and there's a lot of architects on this table, and we all know that. But to say, well, we don't want to give you this data because you're going to misuse it, I think it's actually in districts' interest to have this data get out there. So.
I agree that the information's I think information's important. I think that if the state were to make assumptions with the information they have, that is dangerous. Mm-hmm. I would caution in that if you spent $25 a square foot to modernize or $300 a square foot to modernize, you could have the same facility condition index for both of those facilities when you're done with it. That doesn't necessarily mean anything because it could be dependent upon the ability of the district to ongoing maintenance. That's not even recognized in this entire conversation.
Really good point.
So I don't think you can assess a value to whether or not you've got $25 or $300 a square foot. And I would just be afraid that any information created from this would be assuming something that is in fact not the truth. And you could be making false determinations and false decisions with our future bonds out of this information. I think we have to spend a lot more time trying to figure out what it is that we're trying to achieve by this. And I think this is a great conversation that we're having. I think we need to have a lot more of these types of conversations to figure out before we start putting anything to paper, because we still have no idea what we're trying to achieve here. And I think it's a little premature to try to even talk about a PIW for modernization until we know exactly what it is that we want to achieve out of this, how it's going to be used, what interpretations, what things we should be cautious about in making any evaluations or assessments of the data that is collected.
Well, it's a really good. You make a great point. I totally agree that you can with the interpretation of the data, but I'm just questioning again. What I'm hearing is don't collect the data, and I can't support that.
I don't agree. Don't collect the data. I just need to make sure that we understand what it is that we're trying to do with the data before we start collecting data.
Okay, so
if I could just add to that the data that we collect makes sense. If it's and it is quantifiable, and just having narrative on what somebody did on a modernization project is not quantifiable.
But okay, so how do we let's okay, sorry, go ahead.
On its very basic terms, and it's not often that I like to agree with Bill, but if the state is regularly seeing that the state is only paying for 20% of the modernization, if you've got an overall cost for the modernization, and then they're seeing regularly that local funds are contributing way more than 50%, then I could think would only help out schools that are in financial hardship, like county offices, that receive only 100% of their share from the state. So I think on that type of thing would be very useful, or maybe useful if we get the overall cost and identify what portion is paid for by the state and which one is covered locally. So.
Yeah. A good point. Lee?
Not everyone on the committee believes you shouldn't collect data. Okay, so I think I'm in agreement with you, Bill, on this, and again, I'll apologize. Yeah, so I think that there is a huge difference between $12 a square foot and $75 a square foot even, or $100 a square foot. Give me the $100 and I could give you a good scope, right? But it depends on also existing condition of the school.
Totally,
has any work been done on it before? How old is it? Is it barely the 25-year-old? What's the age?
So stop right there. Okay. So we need to know the age of the building modernized, right?
And the existing condition, because like my schools had swamp coolers. Right, exactly. So to me, Bill, if I could just finish it out. I do believe that and I agree with Eric about having lots more discussion at this level. I also think that if you got together some bona fide, school district facility folks and their architects and their contractors, you could really, well, not necessarily, but a task force. You could put together a simple. I do really believe this, a simple PIW for modernization that would encompass the grand scope of things, the grand scheme of things as far as the gross square footage, age, number of kids. You could get to a per square foot cost, which is what you want. And I still think, interesting or not, useful, yes, I think it's very useful. I'm sick of having to tell the public, but that modernization, the state doesn't give us enough money. And that's all I get to say. And there's no backing for it. There's never any backing. We would have only been able to do this if we had state money. But it's just on this local level. I would love to see more data, quantifiable and qualitative data about what is the extent of that. I believe it's huge. Most school districts deal with this. But, and I do think that you can talk about it not easily, but you can have the checklist. You could say major or minor. You could say, if you have 10 square foot of floor removal, don't even put it in. I mean, just use common sense. What was the major scope of your project? What was the intent of that project? And if you had basic infrastructure that had to be done, all your HVAC needed there, your basic electrical upgrade, all those the basic things, you could talk about that. I do think it's very important. I think it is in our interest to have this data collected. I do agree that we need to make sure it's simple. It does incentivize people to continue to do it because they know what the purpose of it is. And the purpose should be to let people know transparently that the state does not give us enough money for modernization. That's the issue.
So, did you have a comment first, Michael? Sorry.
Yeah, and trying to help staff out here and trying to bring something back, I'm actually way on board with all of these comments. I'm trying to tell staff what can we bring back next month as a proposal? What'll work? What I told them is, why don't we try this route? We get the stick, all your guys' input on what are those different categories that people actually do in a modernization project. We listed some ideas here, but what if the online POW is just a series of checkboxes? Yes, I did this. And if it's possible, maybe we have multiple columns that we can get to the quantified part. How much square footage or how much by dollar, so that we can separate the $2 million projects from the 10 million projects. What is the value? So we can compare apples to apples. If this part did a lot of flooring and this one did just a minor, we know not to compare those two in terms of those amounts. So if we can run that route, and start with just the transparency aspect of a stakeholder came up and said, this district got $2 million, what do? They can pull up the PIW. Oh, I see they did roofing and painting, and they only did roofing on a couple of buildings, not the entire campus. They can think about that. I think there's always the potential for misanalyzing data and misusing it. I mean, that'll always be there. You can't control what a person does with the data, but I think it's important to collect it. So if we can maybe run with Lee's ideas so staff can start going that route, we can start maybe collecting ideas of what people do on mods. That might be helpful. And then maybe next step is, how do we quantify that?
If we could do a little let's make a deal on that, since there wasn't any defense of page 3 and half of page 2. Get rid of all of page 3 and half of page 2, and at the bottom of page 2,
Let's defer that discussion to a future meeting.
put
okay?
the checklist that you're talking about.
Okay, so, Paul, we're going to deal.
win-win.
We're going to deal with those issues at a future date. I hear you. Okay, so yes, Dennis.
Well, I kind of kick myself for suggesting this, but it seems like.
Oh boy, here he goes.
I'll turn off my mic. No, I think in order to make this, if we are going to do this and have it make sense, one of the things that you have to know is the conditions of the quality of the existing conditions.
All right.
Almost need to do,
totally agree.
You almost need to do a condition assessment, getting down to the different materials and
Surprise! It's amazing.
What?
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely correct.
And then that has to be done again after the project is done. And I see the daggers coming out of Eric's eyes. But I mean, that's the only way that it's going to make sense is to do it before and after picture on this and what was actually done.
You're right. I think that there's certainly a lot of interest throughout the nation in facilities condition assessments. Colorado just finished theirs. Kentucky's just finished theirs. New Mexico's just finished theirs. Every school in the state is fully analyzed using professional engineering criteria and architectural criteria. The facilities condition index is created. The condition index is the replacement value. Let's see, it's the cost of the work divided by the replacement value, correct? Somebody want to help me out with that? But anyway, the FCI is a nationally recognized index of what the condition of a school is or a building in any case. So, I mean, I think that there is a lot of interest in California at various levels to have a facilities condition index be a part of, for example, the next bond, so that prior, just as an example, I mean, this is not me talking officially, but if you were to look at the fact that we as a state and as localities might be facing constraints regarding the amount of money that we're able to get due to debt service, that funds would still be difficult to get, we might want to prioritize and find a way to analyze the existing facility stock in the state to say what are the buildings and what condition are they in and what buildings really need to be prioritized for modernization. Then a facilities condition index might become a part of a bond program that from a policy standpoint makes a lot of sense, so that you would do a condition assessment of all the entire building stock, use that as the basis for prioritizing work throughout the state of California. So, I mean, I think that it's a really important piece, and so when we started this discussion, we started talking about scope of work, and then all of a sudden we got down to, you brought it to, well, scope of work compared to what? And what was the condition of the existing building? And so since we don't have an assessment now of every building in the state, but we probably do want to know within some general parameters what the condition is. We probably need the age of the building to at least help us in that, right? Or buildings that are modernized. And so anyway, yeah, that's a really good point. Sorry, I got off on a sidetrack, but I think having a quantified condition before you start is really important. We don't have that now. So I'm not sure how we face that within the modernization information that we're asking for.
Just on process, you had wanted more discussion from this group, and then you were going to take a, quote, full package. You've been instructed to take a, quote, full package to the SAB?
Yes.
Okay. Is that happening next month? Okay. So I guess on process and approach, on both of the items, I don't know where, I know there's many groups working and many discussions about the new program and what it will look like. But on anything, including this PIW, I'm not sure have you guys done pilot well, the PIW already exists for this, but a pilot group of school districts doing the modernization, test it on school districts rather than just put it out. And I guess I would do that on any revised new construction, the current one, and have districts comment and say, this doesn't mean anything. I mean, I don't know whether you guys actually ask for that. Like here,
I know staff did that on the initial run. There was a pilot.
No, but it didn't work.
Okay.
Listen to the comment. I mean, I know you are listening to the comments. It's not. This form's not acceptable in so many ways, and I don't know whether you're getting input, Bill, from anybody else except this group in this format. And I'm wondering if you can again maybe take it out to some pilot school districts and some volunteers who'd say, hey, I'd really like this form to look like this, besides us. I mean, we could form a great task force here and do it offline. And then any PIW for the modernization, I just think that it could be, you'd get a lot of good input if you put out a draft one, like with the checklist that you're talking about, the information that you're saying verbally, write that down, make it into nice questions, a checklist, and see how that flies. Just give it out to a group of pilot projects. And I guess I would
to see whether it's possible to answer the question.
Yeah, see if it's useful. Yeah, see if you're getting back what you want, and see if the districts can easily. And at the end, they say, "Was this easy to fill out? What would you change?" And I'm not sure if you do that, do test studies on it. And I guess I would say the same thing for any facility condition index or assessment tool.
That's kind of why we're here. We're seeking the committee's input, and that's why we actually brought the whiteboard. What questions should we be asking? And we'll just start making a list. Jeremy's ready.
Jeremy's not using the whiteboard.
We ask, and then we can start putting that in a format.
Right, but Bill, it's not. And Michael, with all due respect, this is a great group, and we have a lot of experience in this group. But for school districts to actually go out and test the form, and actually get a group together and have them be some test cases, not just in this format. I really think we're missing the boat if we don't do that.
Okay.
May I, Bill?
Yes, sir. I know you've been very patient, Rob.
Well, I don't have a whole lot to say, so. And Lee, I was one of the test districts when 2 districts were tested with the first round of the PIW, and nothing changed. So I don't know that that's. But I think. I've been struggling with what are we using it for, and I think that has been defined, right? I mean, the board has said it over again as I'm back reading through staff's summary for the agenda item today. We know what it wants to be used for. We know the intent of the form. We just haven't seen it being used yet. So rather than start all over and say, let's start from scratch and say, what are the goals and objectives of the form, that would probably waste a whole day. And I think we all know, and I understand and I appreciate what it wants to be used for, and I'm all about data, and I'm fine with sharing it all. I get frustrated because I know, as we talk about it, the way that it's being asked won't get us to the intent or the conclusion. And so, for modernization, if we want to start throwing out ideas, we could spend quite a bit of time. But as I'm processing all this, there's so many different things. Districts are modernizing campuses that are 18 years old that aren't even eligible for modernization until they're 25 years old, because the only way they were going to get a bond passed was because that community from that high school had to get a piece of the pie. Yeah. And maybe there was one building on that high school that did generate eligibility because it was 25 years old, so maybe we got 75 grants. Of course, we're going to ask for them, but we spent $15 million on the school. You're going to want data like that too, right?
Yes.
So you're going to want a full modernization, even though the state maybe only kicked in 75 grants. And then I would hope that if we're using it to determine the adequacy of the modernization grant, we would have to pretend that the school was fully eligible and what they would have received in funding.
So wait, to help me out with this, the concept that you're bringing up here. Well, it's one of the many.
I think that's where you have the issue of adequacy, is that.
And then you're going to say, well, it wasn't 25 years old, Rob, it was 18.
Right. So if it was only 18 years old, it doesn't have the issues of a 15.
It's an arbitrary trigger to even be eligible. Someone picked 25 years out of the sky. So, but I think, so you have those issues, and then you have And I agree, you're going to have to break it down by building. So we're going to have to give you our building identifications. And, you know, Building A received what we're considering to be a full modernization, but Building D only got this because DSA actually made us do that, right? So you're going to have all these different levels of scope
that's
per
a
building.
really good point. But so in terms of, we are going to need buildings identified.
Absolutely.
So if we're collecting data, you got that, Jeremy?
And you're going to need anecdotal why.
Jeremy, you don't have to use the chart. You can write in your lap. It's all right.
And you're going to need an anecdotal why as to why was that building modernized to that degree or only to that degree.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think that
those are the...
That's where it's difficult to judge adequacy is when those judgments then start.
Yeah, so totally agree. So let's keep going on and just a couple.
But can I just end? I
Go ahead.
still protest. I still think, not protest in the old 60s kind of a way, Berkeley people. We still have to go look at financial hardship projects. If we want to look at grant adequacy, we need to go look at what a financial hardship district gets to build as a new school, and we get to look at what a financial hardship gets to modernize for a school that's fully eligible for modernization. I mean, to me, that's a true test of grant adequacy.
Okay.
Because there's no local match that supplemented the project at all.
I totally agree, and I think that's an important piece. So let's just get into the weeds on this for a second. So if we, the ones that I've heard, we've heard age of buildings. We're going to need something related to identifying the buildings that were modernized, or the number of buildings, or were there multiple buildings. I mean, it's complex, especially when you get into a high school. Oh my gosh, right? There's a lot of complexity there. I totally agree. So Dennis's comment went back to the condition of the existing building, lacking a quantitative evaluation of condition. Age is one, and we got that. And so is there a qualitative evaluation? Mr. Zian, come on up. No, you got to come up here. Uh-oh.
Not to further muddy the water, but just so we don't lose sight of, remember, this is a local level, local decision-making program. That's the way it was conceived. Eligibility may be generated in certain buildings on a campus, and it's used somewhere else. So I think, to have a frame of reference here, so this information makes sense. I like the checklist. I like the condition assessment, but it'll also help to analyze and understand the data to know that the facilities that generated the eligibility in this example I'm using were in good shape. So we chose to use it over here and centralize it all in a gymnasium, for instance, and it'll make sense. So we're kind of getting there with what we're talking about. If you have the building areas where the work is being done, so you have the scope laid out by building types. But I think also, so that we have a frame of reference and we don't lose track of this, what buildings generated the eligibility? I think you got to start there.
Okay, but that's a good point. I like that. You already have that data. So just throw it in the sheet.
We do have it to a certain extent.
You do? Well, wait. If you don't have it, who does?
Well,
it's in the 5004.
We have it by square footage or by teaching stations. Yes.
So you don't identify it by buildings in the 5004? By what building generates it?
No.
It's lumped. It's fuzzy, Bill. But again.
All right. So let me give OPS.
No. Back to accountability. It's not fuzzy. It's very complicated.
Okay.
The 5003 is where the eligibility is determined, and there's a number of backup documents to it that generate the eligibility. And to go recreate that is very difficult and make that relevant to the 04.
Okay. So the task for OPSC is, because we're on the auto population world, if we're trying to come up with what information does the state not have. So
where we use the eligibility and why. That's what Dave just brought up.
But the state does have the eligibility information.
Yeah.
So that needs to get into the form to inform this.
Yeah, but what Rob's saying is, let's say they have 10 buildings that generate eligibility. We get a school map that's not on the 5003. We roll that data up to the 5003 to get the count. Now, when he comes in the future with a 50-04, if he's just modernizing 5 classrooms, we don't necessarily tie the 5 classrooms of funding to these particular 5 buildings that generate the eligibility. It's just it's a base grant, lump sum.
I got 500 grants in the computer,
Right.
and I can use them anywhere on campus that locally my board deems fit.
So how does this play into what we're doing here, what we're trying to accomplish?
I don't think you need it. I don't think you
complexity.
need it. I don't think you need the data. I think you just say, yeah, it was eligible for modernization. And how much did you get from the state for
so
it?
what I heard him say was that there could have been a building that generated the modernization eligibility, and then it was used somewhere else.
So
Bill, what I heard
though?
was is
Why?
that and I love working with Dave, but what he said was is that the buildings that generate the eligibility were fine because we use the eligibility somewhere else, and that's not the truth.
Maybe
That's
the
not
district has
assumption.
already modernized those buildings,
Or-
with their own funds.
Or maybe it's just that our priorities are different.
Right.
Or that, too.
And again, that's what I'm concerned about the information we use. The assumption is because I didn't spend it on the building that generated it, therefore it's fine, and that's not the case. And that goes to the facility condition index. But my local decision making is really what's going to make a determination as to what is going to happen at that particular school and how that eligibility is going to be used. And that's why I don't think the state needs to be involved in understanding what I'm doing at a local level, because it's not going to help you understand what the use of the eligibility or why it was used, because it's strictly local, and you can't compare my single school district or school site in my district to another school site in my district, because there will be no correlation between the two decision makings.
So you're saying that really what we need to focus on is not what generated the eligibility, but where the work was done. Yes. And I think I agree. But so you got to sidetrack then.
Well,
no, that's good. That was a good conversation, though.
I still think it's important to know the facilities that generated the eligibility and to know that they were in good shape. Because if you get off and you start looking at, this eligibility was all centralized in one area, when you're just looking at raw data, it'll raise questions. Why was this host school eligibility only used over here? And there's probably really good reasons for it. It was already modernized with local funds before. It was well maintained. The district has a good facility maintenance program. There may be a million reasons. But what are we trying to do here? We just want to know what work was done with what. The state provided 100 grants, modernization grants. It was either augmented or just complemented, dollar for dollar, or however the locals shared in the project. It's just data we're looking at, but it would be useful to know that, okay, this school right here had facilities that were in good shape, and they chose to use it somewhere else. So we have data on that when this information comes in. We're going to see all kinds of things when this, if we embark on this modernization thing. We're going to see full sites with eligibility that's generated in all the facilities, and there's modernization work through all those facilities. We'll see that. In others, we'll see it centralized in one area or another.
This is a bit of a slippery slope. If the
It is.
intent of the PIW is to address accountability and transparency, you want to know exactly that the state bond funds were spent in eligible projects.
I think
now
we
what
want to
you're
know
talking about is how
we
I
have.
spend the money and what decision making is behind how I spent that money. And I think that is outside the scope of the state's responsibility.
At least with regard to SB 50 and what the voters approved for this latest bond. And this will sound very negative. I don't mean it that way, but it's none of your business. It's true. This program, the beauty of this program was, unlike the lease purchase program, we're going to fund you based on eligibility, and it's up to you to use it the way that you locally see fit. And that's what everybody went out and did. And our accountability is every other Tuesday or every other Thursday night at the podium, and the teachers and the parents of those schools and the school board and everyone else involved. Now, there's still many, many, many laws and requirements we have to fulfill, but the rationale and the logic as to why we use the money in this fashion, that's where you're getting a lot of the resistance, because it's, wow, and in some cases, the people who did it and the boards who did it aren't there anymore. But it was still done in accordance with SB 50. So there's
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Bill also, really, I love to work with Dave also, but this is the problem.
Man, Dave,
this is the problem of that question and just how he worded it. You had buildings that were in great shape, but you didn't use the money on it, and were eligible. They aren't in great shape. They're just other priorities, bigger priorities. None of the buildings were in great shape. We only got so much money, and then you have to decide. Trying to go into that level of detail is why people resist the PIW in the first place.
And I don't think Dave, I don't want to speak for Dave, and by the way, I love working with all you guys, so maybe we stop saying that. But his point is I don't think he's suggesting that they want to do that or we should do that. His point is a good one. If we're going to do the PIW in a way that's going to make it meaningful, you have to have those conversations. I mean, you can't get meaningful information out of a modernization PIW with saying, why did you spend that money on that building? Well, because the other buildings were eligible, but it was actually in worse shape, and our priority at the time was to have a tech services center that we didn't have, or whatever. That's the only way you're going to make it meaningful. And then you get into, wait a minute, why do I have to explain that to you? Go talk to my board president at the time.
Okay, so it's after 12. Can we try and wrap this up by 12:30 and go over a couple of things and give some clear direction to OPSC staff about some of the parameters that we want here? Is there anybody in the audience that wants to make a comment? Please come right up.
Richard Gonzalez and Associates again. I looked at this laundry list that Mike, that you got here together, and that if we use it as a checkbox, it doesn't seem like that's too bad of a problem, but it has to be a box that we check. Under the you got a bullet in here about hazardous asbestos. We have not other items that are hazardous other than just asbestos. So it's just any kind of hazardous material abatement, including lead-based paint. You don't have ADA checked off on here, but that's one of the first things. But if I were to make a list, I wrote down 8 components as you guys were talking.
ADA is on the next page.
Is it on the next page? Well, I was looking specifically at the laundry list that he had.
That's what's in the ed code.
Right, and I'm just saying that to that list add just ADA to it. When I made a laundry list of things that I thought that might be okay to be put on a PIW that wouldn't be onerous, that would be of information to the staff, the first one was, again, what is the square footage of the facility that's been modernized?
Thank you, Richard. I'll consider that a supportive comment.
Yeah. The cost-wise, I think as far as costs are concerned, you want to know what is the difference between what was the hard cost, what were the soft costs.
Yes.
I think beyond that, I think we're back to what Lee said. How do you get there? We can't really get there. You need to account for, was there a new area added in this project as far as the overall costs? And that's been brought up to a degree. Okay. And whether it was state or locally funded is not material, just how much new area was added.
Yeah, no, good point.
So, I mean, I've gone through a list of about 8 different things, and I'm not going to go through every one of them. But
go ahead. That's why we're here.
Classroom count.
Jeremy's writing every word down.
That's right. Good man. He's a good man. A classroom count is great, and then a drop down for those other facilities. Okay.
So we've got the building, we've got square footage of the building, we've got the age of the building.
That wasn't on my list, but
well, it is. So it's on ours.
I find that difficult because you've seen high schools, and there's sometimes as many as 40 different buildings.
I got that. Yes, I know.
But a drop down for checking off only the other types of facilities. Is there a gym? Is there a library? Is there, et cetera? I had that on there. As far as the number of pupils served, I cannot come to a conclusion in my mind on that, because you could use the money, the 100 grants, as we've just talked about, to do nothing but modernize the gym. Does that mean it served 1,500 kids?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
or did it serve 100? Or if we did 4 classrooms and we used 2,000 grants, and all we did is replaced 4 portables with exceptionally good for permanent classrooms. Does that mean it only serves 100, but the grants were 1,000? How do you reconcile those things?
Yeah, no, they're really good. Those are really good questions. Go ahead.
And I just don't know how you get there. As far as your comment about the original quality of the building, okay, given that if you want to get down that road, let's just leave it as the district quantifying it as either it was in good condition, good condition, fair condition, poor condition.
Yeah, that's probably
just 1, 2, or 3 kinds of choices.
So stop right there. So if we're in the absence of a quantitative condition assessment, can we agree that one place we could start would be, what did you say, good, fair, poor?
Good, fair, or poor.
Or maybe on a scale of 5.
What is on the fit?
I'm just saying more of a bigger range than just good.
Excellent. I mean,
she's suggesting a 1 to 5. 5 is good.
Dilapidated.
What is replace it?
Okay, so what we're saying is, so staff, you got that? So some way that we can have a qualitative, descriptive range.
And you could give a description for
You know.
stars thing.
Okay. So we do a Yelp thing?
So let me just make sure I understand.
Hold on, Paul. Stay up here, Richard. Don't go yet.
I got to say, I'm not really a fan of going backwards and evaluating the existing conditions. What we're really, I was hopeful that we're interested in moving forward, find out what you get with your modernization dollar.
We are.
Developing a state assessment of all the conditions of our school facilities. And if we start going to these poor and good, and it really depends on the report and the audience that you're trying to address on the condition of the site with those. I would state, again, we can upload a picture of the school before and a picture of the school after if you want to see what you're getting for your modernization dollar. But I would really would like to get off of going backwards and focus on going forward.
Okay.
Paul, I don't want to be misunderstood as to supporting it. I have a feeling that the directions are there, and that if we're going to go down this road, and we have to go down this road, what is going to be the simplest and least taxing method to do it? Do I recommend that we go through some form of assessment of the existing? No, I don't. Do we need to assess where the building eligibility was versus where we used it? No, I don't think we need to do that either. I support everything that Rob said. You know, why is it we getting involved in this when the state said, here's your money, go and use it, just prove to us that you used it on facilities. And by the way, the rules are the eligibility generated at a school site must be used at a school site on a building that's on that school site. The interesting thing about that is most of these districts have their eligibilities established in 1999. How many buildings have been added since 1999 which are not included on the 5003 when you update it? Because you do not, and you're not required to report those, and in fact you're not allowed to. You're supposed to use the original configuration as your baseline. So there may be 20 or 30 more buildings on there, and I don't mean portables, other buildings, that are now on that site that were not there in 1999. And yet you might be using that money on those buildings.
I think that you raise a really interesting point, which is that for me, that the issue of modernization eligibility and the time that it was originally established under this program, and to me the issue is really that many districts have already modernized their schools, and they need modernization again. And so fundamentally we need to restart the clock. Because the 25-year period is somewhat arbitrary. I mean, this is a question beyond our pay grade. How's that? But I mean, I think we can inform the discussion as a policy element. I was looking for
kinds of things would be okay. If you start getting down to what was the square footage of each of the classrooms, how many classrooms were permanent, how many classrooms were portable, how much building area was it that was included in buildings that were multipurpose rooms and such, so we could figure out what the overall cost per square foot of each, that becomes untenable. I mean, the whole page 2 thing, okay? Now, getting to the point of saying, all right, well, how many of these classrooms were replacements? That's fine. I can hear that, all right? How many classrooms were in the project? 20. How many of those were replacement classrooms? 4 of them. That's a simple and easy question to pose and to be able to respond to in an easy way. The rest of them, you'd have to have your entire, as I perceive it, your entire construction team, from the CM to the construction managers to the contractors, the architects, your inspector, and your staff, to sit down and say, okay, so how do we answer these questions?
And we don't want that. That's not where we want to go.
And for that matter, when it comes down to identifying the scope of the work that wants to be done, I think someone made mention of it. Let the district be judgmental in deciding, well, was that a major component? If it was a major component, then go ahead and check it off. If it wasn't, leave it off. You know, if you had to just go do carpeting in one room.
That's probably a good thought. So, and you're okay, the checklist or drop downs regarding the scope, is it?
You see the train coming, you know what you have to do, okay? And so what you do is you
Get
do
on
what
board.
you have to do, is get on board when you need to, right? But you don't want to pay full fare.
Around the table here.
Thank you.
Richard, you forgot about the grant augmentation for the professional services necessary to complete this form to make it meaningful.
That is something that I do charge my clients for.
That's
Yes,
right.
thank you.
Yes.
I didn't mean that
Bill.
about you. I just think that it's going to cost a lot of money to do this, to do it right.
Well, I actually think that if Bill is listening and the staff is listening, that they could do a simple enough form that it wouldn't take that much time. But
I used to
I'm
like
not-
working with you, Lee.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. But I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic. Bill, I agree with Paul. I know we're moving forward. I actually believe you need to have an assessment of the existing facilities to know how to judge what's needed in modernization. So, for example, maybe you had a 5-star system, and you had a drop down on each star of what that meant. An example, number 1 star. 1 star would be the dang thing is 50 years old and it's never been touched. You know, the next one is the dang thing. Yeah, the dang thing is sucky and it's never been touched. So you know, and it moves from there. We've done some minor work on it with our local funds. We did some deferred maintenance on it. Got some roof replacements on it 20 years ago, and that's about it. I mean, and then you just move up, and maybe you have some examples with that.
Way too much detail. And we're back to now the baseball diamond versus the softball diamond. I'm sorry.
Okay, I hear you. So, Dennis, did you have anything else you want to add? You okay? Mary? You're beaten down? That's good. Okay. So I think we have enough information to hope. So, Mr. Odell, we have your personal commitment that you can come back with a couple of prototype ideas?
At least one. I won't say I'm not going to have 5 ideas, but 5 different versions of it. But
I'm sorry. Yeah, other questions?
I think we have a place to get starting. Thank you very much.
Bill, we're talking about adding the mod, but couldn't we make some progress on shrinking the existing form? I mean, we really have talked about the page 3 is a real problem, and there were a couple of items on page 3 that you thought were essential, but couldn't we shrink page 3 considerably and then look at page 2 and shrinking some of the items on there, especially if we're going to be adding
I think we'll be able to
so we
have some discussion about that.
Keep the form to no larger than 4 pages overall.
Okay.
It is 4 pages currently.
Well, and I will share with you that the high performance page, we are doing some background work with OPSC staff, with CDE, with DSA, and with some of the legislative staffers to look at the high performance page and try and reconfigure that so that we auto-populate that with the energy savings element that we get on the HP1. It's a DSA form. Have you done a high performance project? So when you do a high performance project, you fill out DSA gives you the HP1 that goes over to OPSC, and it tells you how many points so they can calculate the grant increase. But it also tells you the estimated energy savings. So we are looking at that. That's page 4 on the form. And so we have a sort of side group that's working on that, and I think we're going to have some recommendations for that. And I have prepared a memo with some recommendations for some streamlining areas, so we haven't lost sight of the need to do it. And every venue I'm in, I continue to stress how important it is, and just like you are. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Brian. Jeremy, you did an especially good job. Michael, thank you, and all your staff from OPSE. Brian, thank you. And Valerie. So we're adjourned, and our next meeting is in August 12th, 10th. Okay, thanks, everybody.